So my day job is as an economist. And as an economist, I have to tell you the most dangerous words are "this time it's different." The next most dangerous words, by the way, if you're skiing, are "follow me, Dad." But in economics and markets, the most dangerous words are "this time is different." But something different is going on. The labor shortage we're facing today has no precedent in American history. And this means that the business community has something at stake in criminal justice reform in a way we have never seen before. And that's very, very good news. But it also has to be coupled with the realization that the business community has to go about this right if we are going to solve some of our social issues and enlist their critical support in this. So I'm very pleased to be here with Safe and Just Michigan. I've worked with the group before and couldn't be more pleased to work with a group that gets the importance of the inclusion of the business community and why that will help advance the cause of public safety and individual human prosperity. And a key part of this prosperity, of course, is giving second chances to people who've made mistakes in the past, and those mistakes have led to a record. So my message starts out really by talking to the business community. They are feeling the pain of this labor shortage. How many of you have been in a restaurant where they have empty tables, yet they can't seat people because they don't have enough servers? Or they've got abbreviated hours. Well, we think of that as an inconvenience as consumers, but it's very costly to businesses, right? They don't have the ability to make the investments they're going to have to make in the future to stay competitive. For some businesses, this will be an existential threat. They simply can't survive in case they can staff up appropriately. I also like to remind the business community, it's not just the threat they have of not being able to staff up today, serve their customers, grow their business. It's also a threat that the other guy, the other business, your competitor, will figure this out. So there's absolute urgency to this. The backdrop to all of this, why do we have a labor force shortage like we've never seen before? Well, the answer that's a shortfall that is so large, even immigration can't make up for this. And so this is a real threat for the US business community and something that's really becomes a threat for all of us. The key ingredients for growth of any economy or potential growth, how fast can you grow your labor force and how fast can you grow your labor force's productivity? That's all there is to economic growth. If you look at today's birth rates and expectations for entrance into the labor market and take kind of average levels of productivity growth, the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, nonpartisan, estimates that the long-term growth potential of the US economy is not the 4% some of us saw earlier in our careers or the 3% we might have gotten used to in the 80s and 90s. It's not even 2%. 1.7%. And 1.7%, you can individually prosper when the economy is growing at that speed, but you're always hovering on the edge of a recession, right? 1.7% isn't a steady, it's something with wobbles in it, and it's pretty easy to tip into a recession if that's the best that you can do over time. Doesn't mean every year, but on average, if that's the best you can do. So this is something that even if you are fully employed or are retired, we all need to care about these labor force issues. So how did we get here so suddenly? I used to talk, and any of you who saw me in my day job talking for the last couple of years, I was talking about this looming labor shortage. It's not looming anymore, it's here. There's actually a famous line in a Hemingway novel that investment people like to quote when we're talking about corporate bankruptcies and things like that. There's two characters who are having a conversation, and one asks his friend, how did you lose your great fortune? How did you go bankrupt? And he famously replied, 2 ways. Gradually and then suddenly. And this is essentially how we've gotten to it. We were going to have a gradually impactful labor shortage. It was going to come in slowly but surely over the course of decades. And we used to say things like, the baby boomers are going to leave the workforce at the rate of 10,000 workers per day. And that was true and was expected. The pandemic changed the pace. With regard to older workers, the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank estimated that 2.4 million American workers retired early. That's a huge pain point. How do you replace some of your most seasoned, experienced workers at a time when you're dealing with the shortfall of birth rates that happened 20 and 30 years ago? But there are other issues as well. We have this extraordinary situation today where you have more job openings than job seekers. How come they're not finding each other? The pandemic has changed our economy in other ways. People go out less to stores and restaurants and order in more. People work from home instead of commuting in. And all of that has disrupted jobs in a very meaningful way in the economy. So we also have this issue that economists call reallocation friction. You have a resource, workers. You have a need for that resource, job openings. What's holding them back? Well, many people are coming back out of the pandemic and finding their old job doesn't exist. Or it exists in the suburbs, not in the inner city, and they don't have transportation. Or they have to take a job that's lower pay, or have to move to follow a job opportunity. All of these things are tough decisions to make. People put off making tough decisions. If they can get away with putting off those decisions, people were able to put those off for a while, but no longer. And so you're starting to see more matchmaking going on between job seekers and job openings, but it's a gradual process. And so this is part of the reason we've had this shortage. We've looked, every state in the country right now has more job openings than job seekers. Extraordinary. But the range, in California, it's kind of evenly matched. Michigan's in the middle. Places like Utah are on the extreme end, where it's like 2 or 3 times the number of job openings. But everywhere is facing this shortage. So we do think there's going to be some movement around the country, and people are going to find each other and make those tough choices about how far they commute or what job they have. But we're still running short. We've lost a lot of women from the workforce, particularly when schools were closed. Many times in a 2-income household, a parent chose to stay home with the children. It's not exclusively women, but statistically it's overwhelmingly women. Some will likely stay out forever. We've actually seen some signs that they're coming back in. This is something where employers can help themselves with more flexible policies to sustain working parents who want to be employed. So there's a lot that the business community could do. But what I want to focus on is something that we've seen rear its ugly head before. In 2008, 2009, we had a deep recession, as you know, the great financial crisis, and we came out of that with a lot of the same characteristics, those mismatches. We weren't seeing people get back in the job market. We're seeing people drop out of the job market. And for many ways, this was the start of my own journey of research when I started to understand that a big impediment to workforce growth was social ills. And we're social ills. And we've all, of course, had social ills all the time in our history. But the social ills, when you looked in the last decade, 15 years, were of a magnitude we had never seen before in US history. And they boil down to long-term unemployment. We had in the great financial crisis, people had been out of the workforce a long time. Economists technically refer to long-term unemployment as 27 weeks or longer, 6 months or longer. Once you have been unemployed for 6 months or longer, it gets really hard to get back in the workforce. Think about where we are today. People who lost their jobs early in the pandemic have been unemployed for 2 years now. Really hard to get back in, particularly true for older workers. The opioid epidemic, we know, just as in the wake of 08-09, the opioid epidemic was getting in the way of workforce growth, and obviously tremendous human tragedy through overdose deaths, but it was more than the overdose deaths. It's still estimated that 10 or 11 million Americans are taking opioids for non-medicinal purposes. Now, many of those are employed, but they can't be employed in places where drug testing is required for workplace safety. And a lot of those jobs, transportation, manufacturing, are great pathways to the middle class or to a life of accomplishment and participation, particularly for those who don't have college degrees. It's a great pathway. If you can't pass a drug test, you can't get on that pathway. And we don't know a whole lot about this statistically because it's hard to get the data, but we do know that last year was tragically a record number of drug overdose deaths. So this is very much present again today. And then there's the last one, and the reason we're here today, which is criminal justice involvement. And this is one where I actually think the deepest and broadest solution to American businesses' workforce shortage lies. This is not just the problem, the way most people think of this as a problem, it's an opportunity. And the people who've been justice impacted are a resource, not a burden for all of us if we do this right. And we have to get there. This is a representation of the difference between job openings and job seekers. So when you have a high number, the green up top, that means how many excess workers you have relative to job openings. And you can see that spike on the right was the pandemic. Suddenly we didn't have many job openings and we had a lot of people looking for jobs. But look where we are today. And we don't take this data, it just goes back to 2000. We don't have the data back farther, but I feel pretty comfortable saying we've never seen anything like this in American history. We have today 11 million job openings and 6 million job seekers. We have 5 million more openings than job seekers. Even if every one of those job seekers were going to land a job, which probably won't happen, some will drop out, you'd still be short 5 million. Even if we hit a recession and many of those employers pull back on some of those job openings, recession, I can't, let's not fill that job, you'll still have millions unfilled openings. This is not going away. The business community cannot afford to overlook this issue. It won't go away, and it's something that, fortunately, the problem-solving skills of the business community are starting to turn. So ultimately, what is the solution? The solution has to be, if you can't do anything about birth rates 20 and 30 years ago, and I don't think immigration policy is going to change meaningfully in the US, we better look at our own population and make sure that everyone who is willing to work and able to work can be equipped to participate in the economy and work. Economists measure this by something called the labor force participation rate. What percentage of your adult population, technically your civilian, non-institutionalized adult population, what percentage of them are in the job market, meaning either actively employed or actively seeking employment? This goes back to 1948. That's the start of modern data collection in the US economy. You'll see in the middle there, there's this kind of rising trend. That's when we had those 4% growth rates in the 80s and 90s, because we had more and more people as a percentage of our population joining the workforce, as well as a growing working age population. It was the sweet spot for us. And two things were at work. One, the entry of the baby boom population without really losing another big demographic wave, and critically, the entry of women into the workforce. That was the secret sauce to US economic growth. So the business community has had to change its practices in the past to be more inclusive and found it was a key to prosperity, and that's the challenge today. You can see on the far right-hand side, starting in 2000, that the peak, you started declining. That was starting to lose the baby boomers. That was those social ills that I just mentioned. And then in the far right, that sharp decline due to the pandemic. And the good news is we're recovering. The bad news is we're not even up to where we were pre-pandemic in terms of workforce participation, and we're way below where we were in the peaks of labor force participation. So where do we go? Who's missing? Who's on the sidelines that we can bring back in? And my argument is that the single best resource is people who have been sidelined, either not in the labor force, either unable to get a job and unemployed beside looking, or also critically employed below their potential because they don't have the kind of labor mobility to switch jobs. They may get an entry-level job, maybe a low-wage job, but they can't move up the ladder the way the rest of us can. Why this pool? Well, it starts out with just the numbers. There are a couple of different ways of measuring it. I focused on this number in orange there. That's the 19 million Americans with felony convictions, because that's the big barrier. Misdemeanors are an issue too. That far number you hear about, the 70 million or 77 million you hear about, that can include traffic violations, which probably aren't much of an impediment, tax liens, which probably aren't much of an impediment. So it's a mixed bag, but at least those 19 million are hardcore barrier, with a felony conviction, hardcore barrier to advancing and participating in our mutual shared prosperity. So when I look at numbers like this, I say, not a burden, a resource. And how do we tap that resource? Well, first of all, we have to understand that this is very much part of the problem. It's not just my saying it. There's statistical evidence that there's a close correlation between justice involvement and unemployment. So Rand Corporation, the think tank, just did a study of unemployed young men and found that by age 35, of the unemployed young men, 64% have been arrested, 46% have been convicted. Criminal justice is impacting our employability. And we know things like the University of Georgia study that this has not impacted all communities equally, the burdens of the criminal justice. 1 in 3 black men in America have a felony conviction. And then when you get into that, has community-wide impacts. So this is something that is really standing in the way of who we should aspire to be as Americans. You can't be part of the American dream if you have these barriers. You can't be part of the American dream if mistakes of the past where the dues have been paid continue to be punished for a lifetime. So we need to do a lot better than this. But why this talent pool? Well, I keep coming back, and you won't hear me talk too much about the ethical case of second chance hiring. I leave that to others, because I want to talk directly to the business community and say, this is a business case. This is business, not charity. And it's very important. I understand we have businesses in the room, but we also have people involved in justice reform. We all have to understand this, because from the standpoint of nonprofits and justice reform community, please understand, businesses will write a check for a compelling story from a nonprofit, but they'll only hire someone who can add value to their enterprise. If we are going to address this problem, it has to be a business proposition. And if we are going to address the 19 million or the 70 million, however you want to count it, that's a problem of such magnitude, we have to be able to scale it up. And the only way you can scale it up is if it's profitable for the business community to do so. So how is it profitable? Well, first of all, you broaden your applicant pool. You know, how many businesses are complaining today, I can't get any workers? Well, some of it is you're not speaking to every community. Particularly, and I think most of you know this, the justice-impacted community is so used to defeat in job hunting. that they don't always look at Indeed.com or Monster.com. And so I always tell businesses, think about how you are posting an opening. Are you telling in the description, most opening descriptions will say, we don't discriminate against, race or religion. Maybe we should also be saying, if you have a criminal record, you'll be given a fair chance. Maybe we should be using some of the job boards that speak directly to this community, 70 Million Jobs or honestjobs.co. These are jobs boards designed to speak to this community, because by advertising there, you're sending a signal that we get it. And so these are all things that the business community can change its practices, and you get that greater diversity, broader pool. And also, of course, given the disproportionate racial impact of criminal justice, you're also going to address some of your diversity goals. In fact, you can't address your diversity goals. You can't have a workforce that reflects the diversity of our population if you're not also offering a pathway for second chance hiring. It's also more profitable if you do it right, and we'll talk about what that means. The companies that do it right, which means you source appropriately, support appropriately, find that the workers who come from this background have a lot of grit. That's the word I hear used to describe people who are used to adversity and conquering adversity. That's a great characteristic. And this is where you can find people with grit. But you also need to, also will find that people who have faced this kind of adversity are also very grateful for the opportunity and eager to re-engage. I think it's just human nature. We've all fallen down and been less than the person we wanted to be. Whether that resulted in a criminal record or not, we all have times in our life. People of character, and that absolutely includes people who have criminal records. People with character pick themselves up and redouble their efforts to prove that they're worth more than their worst mistake. And so what we find, and statistically can show in the studies that have been done, people who have been hired through appropriate second chance practices are more engaged and more loyal. And if you get people who care about what they do and stay in one place, stay with you, they tend to be very, very productive employees, and productive employees are profitable employees. So it's just good business. I also think that we need to recognize that it is possible that not every single person with a criminal record can be a good employee. People have a lot of trauma. People have, for whatever reason, it's not my place to judge what's in people's hearts, but we have enough of a track record to know that there are repeat offenders, and maybe we're not going to be able to reach every single person. So if that's true, businesses should rush to this before their competitors get it. I want, as a business person, if I'm going to approach an employment pool, I want the pick of the crop. I want to get the very best out there before my competitors. So I think there's some urgency to this. And of course, I'm talking about this from the standpoint of the businesses, just their standpoint. What do they get out of it? But let's face it, we all get something out of it. More prosperous economy, one that can grow better than the 1.7%, because we're adding people to the workforce beyond expectations. We're making them more productive. And we also know we're going to have stronger communities and safer streets. We all benefit from this. But we have to do it the right way. And what I'm currently most concerned about is not that businesses won't consider this, but that they'll do it the wrong way. And I'll talk about some of the models that we've seen that represent the wrong way. What's the right way? You need a candidate selection process. Who's ready to be a good fit for your enterprise? And you need a support process. There's nothing exotic about this from the business standpoint. This is a standard talent acquisition model. Let's find out who's good and a good fit for us. Let's make sure we can help them thrive. This works across any talent pool. You can go to, Harvard Business School, try to find the good fits, support them, they'll work. That's a pretty picked over, expensive talent pool. This population is not picked over. There's lots of opportunities for the business community to find great employees. But you have to look in a different way, and you have to support them in a different way. What does that mean? Well, let me talk about how, and again, I know not everyone's a graph person. Let me try to work with you on this. When you just go and look at a traditional talent pool, businesses like to think that they have all their employees are fabulous employees, but everyone knows that's not the reality, particularly for large enterprises. You can have a sort of law of large numbers. For those of us of a certain age, will remember the Prairie Home Companion, where all the children in Lake Wobegon were above average. It doesn't work that way in the business community either. And you get a distribution, and the vertical axis is percentage of hires, and you have some who are worse or some that are better than average. And it's always a challenge. You're always trying to move that so your average is always better and better. But some of your best employees retire. Some of your best employees get poached by competitors. And it takes time to either coach up your worst employees or to get them out of your enterprise if it's not a good fit. So this is what it looks like. What happens when you approach the talent pool, a second chance talent pool? Well, and again, I apologize for the small font here, but you can see here's a way of going about this that tends to get you worse than average compared to the traditional talent pool. This is what I call the disposable employee model. And we've all seen it. It's low-wage jobs where the employer is really just looking for a cheap employee and is not looking for someone who's going to stick around long and is going to prosper and add to their skill base. They just want cheap. And it's often augmented by things like the work opportunity tax credits that subsidize the wages of these employees. I do not condemn this model, because at least it's better than saying, no, we won't hire you. But it's not really a sustainable model, I think, for when you look at a labor shortage. This worked in an abundant labor market where, okay, we brought someone on, we didn't really invest in them, they only stuck around for a while, but they were cheap, because I got the work opportunity tax credit. Not sure that's going to work once the rest of the business community starts figuring out there's a real talent pool here. More commonly, and this is something I've heard again and again, is where you have this weird, you have companies tell me about your second chance hires, and they tell me they were either my best employee or my worst employee. And that's what those double humps there are. How did that come about? Well, it's from businesses that are traditional, have a traditional approach to talent. I want to interview people, try to find out who's a good fit, and support them. The problem is they may have identified people, but they don't necessarily know how to support this population and what's required. And so you get people who just don't show up. And a lot of companies have no show, no call, no job rules. Well, this is a real life example. Maybe your employee had his or her car break down, and it was a $300 repair. And if my car broke down, it was a $300 repair, I'd call AAA because I got a membership. I'd call my boss and say, if I was due in, I'd say, I'm going to be a little late, my car broke down, and I'd give a credit card to the auto shop. But if you don't have $300 in the bank, you don't have a AAA membership, you don't have the mentoring and experience in your life and family to know you're supposed to call in, or you don't have a cell phone to call in, you might just think that's it. And you need employers that understand that the needs of this population to thrive are very real, but they're not necessarily the same needs you'd have if you were recruiting out of Harvard Business School. But when you pair up sourcing, how do you find who's ready, and what kind of specific supports do they need? And these are often supports needed not because of a criminal record, but because of a lifetime of intergenerational poverty and lack of mentorship. But if you can make up for that, that's when you get this true second chance model. That's where all the studies show if you do this right, you get an exceptionally engaged and loyal employee. That's where you get that hump to the right. On average, compared to your traditional workforce, these can be better hires. This group can be better hires. And so we who care about this issue have to be very careful. You know, I've been in presentations where someone says, we're going to be the first employees in and the last ones to leave. Well, that's not the experience of a lot of employers unless they've pursued this model. So we have to recognize that a lot of employers have had a bad experience, and the challenge is to teach them that the problem is not the population, the people, the problem is their process. So what's the right process? Well, it's recognizing the barriers that exist. And these barriers are formidable. Some of them are very hard barriers, professional licensing restrictions, and all these things that many of you know are called collateral consequences. These are punishments that keep on punishing even after someone's sentence is served. And some of them are there for, you know, reasonable accommodations to public safety. You don't want someone with, you know, DWI, 5 DWIs last month driving your children's school bus. I mean, there's a common sense reasons, but they're overly broad. And moreover, I've found that many employers don't know whether they can or cannot hire people with records and tend to be overly broad in the interpretation. And there's usually more people you can hire than you think you can hire. And you get the kind of objections that are often cultural objections. Gee, am I gonna have safety issues? Am I gonna have liability issues? You have to address those. You can address those. No one's saying you have to hire everyone. You still have standards for who's a good fit. You see a concern. My friend Rob Perez, who has one of the top rated on Yelp brunch restaurants. It's in Lexington, Kentucky. He hires almost exclusively from halfway houses, people with a past history of addiction, which of course tends to lead to criminal records as well. He said people, when he first opened his restaurant, weren't coming. I said, were they afraid? He said, no. They thought they couldn't do a good job until I proved through nonstop 5-star reviews that second chance doesn't mean second rate. And that is something that employers need to learn and address. And then there's this reputation risk. Gee, will I scare away customers? Will they think there's a problem? I think that's kind of an old-fashioned view. And we know from all sorts of surveys that consumers want to do businesses with companies they think are adding to society. And there's hard to find a way to better add to society than second chance hiring. We also know employees, particularly millennial and Gen Z employees, want to work for companies that are doing more than generating profits for shareholders. And again, this is a really powerful way to signal that. So you can deal with all these objections. I think where things get stuck a lot are in the HR review process. If someone gets through the process to the degree that the employer or the manager wants to hire them, a recruiter, the criminal background check is going to get reviewed. Where it happens depends on whether you're a ban-the-box state or not the ban-the-box state, but it gets reviewed. Who does the review? Well, all too often, the review is done by people who are in position, often in an HR function, who know that if they make a good hire, everyone says, yeah, that's your job. If they make a bad hire, and it's someone with a criminal record, they feel it's a career threat. So companies have to change their process. How do you change the process? Have a committee approach. Make one person an advocate. Their job is to advocate every time why we should hire. Have someone who's on the line of business, not just an HR professional, someone on the line of business who's feeling the pain of that open position. Or kick it upstairs. So say in Western Michigan, Cascade Engineering does a lot of this very, very well. Cascade has these reviews go up to the executive suite because those people don't have the same career risks if something goes wrong in these decisions. So there are ways to address this. You have to address this. It's one of the kind of barriers that's been in there. What it does come down to is someone at the top has to endorse this. And they can even do things like quotas. My friend Jeff Brown, who's someone mentioned in the book, you'll see Jeff is a grocer. He's a 4th-generation grocer in Philadelphia. He happens to be, of the 12 supermarkets he owns, half of them are what in North Philadelphia what would otherwise be food deserts. But he said, I know, because my great-grandfather had a store like this, that you can have a profitable, clean, safe, nice, fully stocked grocery store with reasonable prices in these neighborhoods. And as part of that, he realized he had to build relationships with the neighborhood and hire. So he tasked his managers, his executive team. He said, we're going to have a quota. We're going to start this. We're going to hire 6 people with criminal records. And he told them, if you can't find 6 qualified candidates with criminal records in the city of Philadelphia, the problem is not the people of Philadelphia, the problem is you. Last statistic, 500 of his 2,500 employees were second chance. He even started his own nonprofit, went to a African-American church, said, here's what I'd like to do. They said, how can we help you? He said, can I use your basement to set up a mock grocery store for training? And that grew into a nonprofit. He even trains for his competitors because he knows that this will make the city of Philadelphia more prosperous. So there are ways that leadership is critical. And then you have to change, where you post the job, how you review it, and get the line of business involved in this and sold on this as well. So how do you find people who are ready? One of the best ways is to partner with people who've built relationships, re-entry nonprofits, for example. Some of those are going to be national organizations like Goodwill. Some are going to be very local. Every community of any size has an American Job Center or Workforce Board. You can find them on careeronestop.org, I believe it is, maybe it's .com, or even government, partnering with the Department of Corrections, partnering with parole and probation officers. What kind of gaps do you need to solve? What kind of support? Some of it starts with those probation and parole officers. People who have left incarceration, or even those who've been convicted without incarceration, often have obligations as part of their supervision. Make sure you're providing flex schedule, or better yet, if you have several people, a room in your facility for those meetings. Give the probation and parole officer free coffee. Partner with them, and they can even be a talent referral resource for you. Transportation's a big one. Housing's a big one. Financial education. The critical thing is employers have to understand this is not a cost, this is an investment. Think of the kind of investments businesses make. I always cite the example of McDonald's Corporation, which moved its headquarters from the suburbs of Chicago about an hour west, which would be 3 hours in rush hour, but an hour west of Chicago, to right to the city, because that's where young talent could be found. That building cost them, I believe it was $200 million to build. Why'd they do it? In search of talent. Not only does this cost nowhere near this, a lot of it is going to be a free resource because many of these nonprofits can partner with you. It's part of their mission. Of course, you should give back as an employer and be a good partner to them as well. But there are people who can support this, and organizations and government entities that can support all of this. It's just a matter of not only making sure that they are there and ready, but make sure you can help your employee navigate to these resources. So businesses that have really taken this on do things like hire life coaches or an extra HR person who's really a navigator, or they hire an HR person whose background is social work. All these things to help people prosper and be great employees. It's not charity, it's business. There's other kinds of models out there. Transitional employment, the Center of Economic Opportunity, which is in 20-odd cities, last count, based in New York, provides transitional employment. They'll kind of judge people, grade them, kind of get them into shape and on expectations that employers will have. There's second chance staffing agencies. That's a growing area in many, many cities. People who will take care of the mentoring side, will take care of the resource side. This is a temp to hire model. Often temp to hire doesn't work because the best employees get picked over. This group is so overlooked and underappreciated. You'll find fabulous employees through temp to hire models. Incarceration work experience, and I'm pleased to know I'm not talking about abusive practices here. These are like work release programs where people are paid prevailing wages, really help people get moving along. Advanced professional training. Here we are in Michigan, home of the vocational villages. People are walking out with industry recognized certifications and training, very powerful. And you'll notice there are places like DTE Corporation has approached the vocational villages and said, can you train for this? And so that's the kind of partnership we want to foster. Entrepreneurship, of course. And then I'll also mention things like second chance internships, particularly in government. Government's an employer. They should be stepping up. I don't know why every city in this country of any size doesn't have a second chance internship program. Here in Michigan, I know they're working on, Chief Justice McCormick is working on creating a jobs reentry court, taking people, yes, who've been arrested, but where the prosecutor also agrees this is not a criminal mastermind, just a dumb kid who can do better, and they'll work with court supervision, but get employment. These are really powerful tools. We obviously need much better policy, things like bail reform, where we're not penalizing people for poverty, we're not taking them out of the workforce unnecessarily. Doesn't mean you have to compromise public safety. Someone's a threat to public safety, you can still keep them in, you just have to prove it. So these are really important reforms. There's a chapter in the book, which you all have, that even talks about reforms. Bail reform is part of it. Clean slate, things that Michigan is actually a national leader on. So this is great. Okay, here's the call to action. This is what I call bridging the box. It's a big step for employers to go from not hiring people with criminal records to hiring people recently incarcerated. You don't have to take it, you get to test the waters. And so there's a number of steps. I outline them in the book, of course, in greater detail, but things like low-risk hires. Most businesses would agree that if someone had a conviction 20 years ago and has been home, rebuilding a life, gainfully employed, stable housing for 10 years, that's just another employee. So why are we excluding them in our process? So recognize low-risk employees. Know your felony, get educated. Don't just exclude, look at the records, what really happened. I always give the example of, and we know this, John Pfaff at Fordham University Law School has done a really good job outlining how, a lot of how we got to this over-criminalization is we incented prosecutors to overcharge. And we've all know stories of this. The one I often share is a 19-year-old woman who was enrolled in a workforce development program founded by a friend of mine in New York City. He took women out of dangerous, abusive home situations, gave them a safe place to live. If they had children, they had childcare, opportunity to advance their education. This young woman in particular was out on a date. Fine. She was caught with 2 fake IDs. She's trying to get a drink. She was charged with a felony. Because in New York State, as a result of post-9/11 anti-terrorism measures, 2 fake IDs with intent to defraud, like trying to get a drink when you're underage. I guess I would have been a felon in New York City when I was young, was a felony or could be charged as a felony. And the prosecutor chose to do that. Fortunately, my friend intervened, hired a prominent defense attorney in New York, so prominent the judge looked up and said, "What are you doing here?" Anyway, but these are the kind of things that happen in our justice system. You have to understand, know what's out there and what could be a felony. It's not often what you think it would be. Connect with second chance pioneers. There are businesses in every state. There's a wealth of them in Western Michigan in particular. Is one of the centers of successful second chance employers. Get to know them. Connect with nonprofit partners. This is your potential talent pipeline. Don't stand in the way of businesses that are trying to do this. So with vendor restrictions, it's very common in universities and healthcare facilities. Not only won't hire, but they won't allow the vendors, the people who are mowing the lawn, to bring people onto their location who have a criminal record. Stupid, right? And particularly, I think, in the case of healthcare institutions, somewhat shameful. This has a lot to do with community health. A friend of mine in another state has a business that they refurbish things like x-ray machines, take them out and sell them to like rural hospitals that couldn't otherwise afford these the CAT scan machines and things like that. And a prominent hospital in his state would not let him bring the quarter of his employees who had criminal records on site. And he went to the CEO. He said, "Who do you think is walking the halls of your hospital every day visiting patients? They have inner city locations. There are people with felony convictions walking in that hospital every day." And he said, "Here I am. I vouch for people. I stand behind their work. And you won't let me bring people on, and it still stands that way today. So if you are a business decision maker, make sure you're not excluding people unnecessarily from your vendor situation. And then the final one I'll say is offer amnesty. I have a good friend in Chicago. He has a felony conviction that's maybe 30 years old, came home 25 years ago, not only gainfully employed, he's kind of a superstar in his company, just got a big promotion, been making six figures with them, which means he's been contributing a lot to their bottom line for decades. He lives in fear that one day his conviction will be uncovered, and under the rules of the firm, he would be automatically terminated. If someone, and you have cases of this in all sorts of industries as well, this is really a tragedy. If someone's been contributing to your enterprise for a period of time, offer them amnesty. Let it be known that no one's background will be held against them if they've been a successful employee. So there are lots of resources out there. The Getting Talent Back to Work certification by SHRM, Society of Human Resource Management, is excellent. It's a very involved thing. Kudos to SHRM, largest human resource trade organization in the world, 300,000 members. They make money, right? They sustain themselves from memberships and certification fees. They've opened this up to non-members and they've made it free. So real tribute to their leadership. Dave's Killer Bread Foundation is doing a lot of work here. They have a playbook. Checker is a background check organization that is also a second chance employer. And the Checker Foundation is a new foundation that's really supporting all of these efforts in second chance hiring. Ken Oliver, my friend, who happens to have been incarcerated, so he's had the lived experience, as the new CEO of that foundation, and is going to do a great job. This will take you 30 seconds. Level Set is a consulting firm, levelset.us, and right there they'll see there's a hiring assessment, an assessment questionnaire. It's just 10 questions. And I don't agree with all of them, but it's kind of a fun way to say, what do you do in your hiring practice? It'll take you 30 seconds. I'd urge you to do that. And then, of course, you all have a copy of the book. I am the only author who's going to tell you, don't read my book cover to cover. Do turn to page 145 and read the case study of JBM Packaging. And I forgot how many pages that chapter is, called 15 pages. It's a company, a second generation manufacturing company, about an hour outside of Cincinnati, that came to second chance hiring because they were desperate. They tried everything else. The CEO of the company, Marcus Sheenshank, heard about this in his church, said, I'm going to try it. He mentioned it to his father, the founder of the company. His father said, you're crazy. They're about a quarter of their workforce now is second chance. It has been so successful, they set up a paid training program in an Ohio prison. The trainer, incidentally, is one of their employees, former employees who made a mistake, was sent to a different prison. They had him transferred. He's now a paid trainer in there. So they have a study pipeline, people who are skilled and can get paid more because they're skilled. And they do all the sorts of things you would hope for in terms of supporting this client base. One thing that's not in the book, so a postscript to this that I think is really important. Their business has grown so much because of this hiring program, because they have not had a labor shortage. They've had to open a second facility. They chose to open this facility in inner city Cincinnati. When's the last time you heard a manufacturer say, I want to open up my new facility in the inner city because that's where my talent is? Think about how transformational that can be for the state of Michigan and for every city in the United States. If we can transform the perception and the reality for the business community that the inner city is not a place to avoid, it's a place where you find talent, we'll have accomplished an awful lot as we do that. So with that, let me say thank you, and I'd be delighted to take any questions. So, yes, thank you. No, Joe, don't interrupt the applause. I don't get that much of it with economic talk, so.
Two things. This state has come a long way on licensing for second chances to get out of people's places so they can get jobs. We even have a codified statute that we would guarantee, if you will, somebody coming out against a liability.
Yep. Very important.
don't know about it.
Yeah.
They use liability as the excuse. That's one thing. And then secondly, the company I work for is guilty of this as well. We blame Medicaid. The federal government excludes certain occupations. So when it comes to healthcare, we can't hire certain people. How do we get past the federal government getting out of the way so we can trickle down?
So I think the answer is the business community has to be more involved in reform. And here in Michigan, you're fortunate to have Safe and Just Michigan because it's one of the most effective statewide reform groups that I know of. On a national front, you're starting to see groups like the Responsible Business Initiative for Justice are really starting to step up. So much of this is still focused state by state. Sadly, the federal government has been lagging in this. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce is paying some attention. The Second Chance Business Coalition is starting to get more involved in this. I don't have a good answer for you other than the business community has to be very loud and clear on this. And, I just say to businessmen, how do you want your workforce treated? Your current workforce and your future workforce, and I think that will inform a lot of this, but I don't have a better answer, I apologize. Yes?
So I've had 3 guys that work for me that have criminal backgrounds, but I've had others work for me, and I found that the younger they are, the less reliable, that they make you think you're invincible, and so they back down still power when they are.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, and particularly for employers that are just starting out on this and are trying to gauge what are the lowest risk hires. Criminologists have long recognized that people age out of crime, and one of the challenges here is every employer I talk to, their initial thing is, yeah, just send me people who've been convicted of low-level drug crimes. That's not always your best bet. I mean, yeah, everyone has to be looked at truly as individuals, but sometimes they're still addicted. Sometimes they're just haven't had enough life experience or mentoring. Picking, statistically, your best bets are people who've actually been away for a long time and are older. That goes against the grain. I know employers can't start there psychologically getting comfortable, but age, and it is also within the EEOC guidelines for how you can address a criminal record, age, how much time has passed since the criminal record occurred, and all of those things can be taken into account. I still think the best way is if you can partner with a nonprofit that really gets to know people and can say this person's ready or not ready, can be part of the solution as well. Yes?
So the other thing I found is like, one guy who's been with me, second longest, 7 years maybe, of love and love these guys. They're brothers, they're brothers. Not only do I have their loyalty, and they work so hard, their sisters just love me to death because I didn't know they had criminal background when I hired them. I just saw them working and they worked super hard. So I hired them when they did hard work. And then the other thing is,
Well, and let me just say, what's not to love about an employer that takes a chance on people and doesn't judge them by their criminal record? So, thank you. And
it was. But the other thing is that I've since helped the one that's working the longest, buy a home. And he didn't know how to pay his property taxes, so I found the property taxes and, but he also drives. The challenge is he drives and I can't, there's liability, he doesn't have a driver's license because he has to pay for that flow thing to be on the steering wheel. And it was, I don't even know what crimes they did, I've
Yep.
never asked. But, I do know that he has to have that flow thing on the steering wheel and it's out of his price range. And I don't know how to help him, he doesn't have a driver's license, so he puts even that much more.
yeah, and sometimes there are nonprofits. I can't speak to every locality, but that can help with that kind of thing or help you find funding for that kind of thing. I would look at Every state has some kind of a job training grants that are available. I'm told in most states it's very difficult to navigate the paperwork, but that might be something you could wrap into that. And so, you know, that would be kind of the thought for that. One of the challenges here is, and for employers is, you know, I speak across the country on this, and there's no 1-800 help me out line that's a national solution, so it's very local, but perhaps some of the people in the room here might be able to connect you with a resource as well. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, no, thank you. So for those who couldn't hear the question, the observation was all the lifers or really long sentences that are in Michigan that are sapping our economy of talent. And you know, people who are involved in this kind of thing have sort of a spectrum of where they are. You know, I've been a victim of crime, including violent crime. And so, you know, there should be consequences for bad actions. Some of those consequences can rightly include incarceration, but only to a point, right? And I think the more we get the business community involved in this, the more we'll get a more appropriate balance, because there's no one taking the other side except some, you know, big-hearted reform people. But who is there to say, why are we locking someone up for 3 decades? That should be more like a 5 or a 7-year sentence. That's where I think the more that this progresses, the better off we will be as a society, because it'll have the business community with its money, influence, and power saying, wait a second, we can't afford this talent loss. And I think there's also more that can be done with these work release programs in prison, fairly paid, compensated in prison work opportunities can help with all of this too. And it's just, it's going to take time and more involvement on the business community.
One thing I think that business community might support, and I've never thought of that until I heard you, is the good time legislation allowing people to get time off.
Absolutely. Now, I live in Florida, which doesn't have that. But yeah, incentives, we don't really have great incentives for people. One of the things that a philanthropist in Philadelphia or near Philadelphia, someone also in the investment industry heard me speak, and he has generously funded, we've sent, we're up to nearly 500 of my books to prison libraries, because ultimately it's a message of hope. And you'll see the book actually starts with a note to the currently incarcerated, which is, you know, not my core audience, but I thought that people should understand, who are currently incarcerated should understand that there are people like me who understand that they're not a burden, they're a resource. And I think that will, I want people to have hope. I've had so many people tell me, when I went to prison at age 18, I thought my life was over. No 18-year-old should think their life is over. And so I think that we've had this sort of vicious cycle in the United States where we over-incarcerate, over-punish, have these terrible collateral consequences, which makes people unemployable, or the business community perceives them as unemployable. So we have high recidivism rates, or high, even for stupid technical violations that send people back in, and you have this terrible cycle. Now is the opportunity to create a virtuous cycle where we in the business community start to see this as a true talent pool and can start then advocating for smarter justice policies that will help not only people who have made mistakes, but ourselves get access to a talent pool. So, yes, sir.
What countries are getting this story?
You know, anecdotally, you hear the Scandinavian countries do a good job. I don't know. I'm paid to be a professional skeptic. I believe nothing I see, and until I've dug in. And I do know that, say, recidivism statistics mean different things in different countries. And so, you know, you hear really low recidivism. Sometimes it's because they measure it differently. So the numbers that people quote most often here are actually rearrest statistics. not reconviction. In large parts of Europe, it's did you go back in for the same crime? So I think it's fair to say that those countries are doing better. I also think that countries that have less income disparity probably do better because people with criminal records, often it's come out of deep poverty wherever you are. Here, we've got such a gap, and I'm not passing judgment on that. I'm a capitalist, right? I work for a bank. I mean, I'm not necessarily against that, but it does separate us out socioeconomically, so we tend not to know people who have made mistakes. Or, I have a very wealthy friend who, has kind of been very skeptical of my work and almost against it. And I said, wait a second, you have boys. And then his wife chimes in, yeah, we have a program in our very wealthy town where if a kid makes a mistake, he goes works for the park district, and does, rakes leaves for 5 weekends, and that's his. And I'm like, that's not how it works in large parts of the country. And so we need to, part of this education process is broadening our understanding of what it means to have a criminal record, or how easily people, particularly because of poverty, can slip into this cycle. So, Josh.
Yeah, so one of the things that you talked about was some of the innovative programs that the Michigan Department of Corrections has done. One thing I've said for years is that prisons shouldn't contract with people who don't do second chance training in prison or hire people outside. I'm wondering what other things you've seen around the country that might make prisons a better bridge to those things.
In Kansas, they're starting a career campus, and they're actually doing fundraising from the business community for this. So that's something that is kind of similar to the vocational village model, but getting very direct commitments from the business community. I'm flying at the end of the month to Minnesota for a terrific nonprofit called the Redemption Project that starts businesses mentoring and interviewing effectively 6 months before release. And they also have a program that starts well before that. So those are the kind of ways you're getting connections. The business community is uniquely open to this today. The labor shortage is number one, and I will tell you the murder of George Floyd was another, because people who have never been touched by the justice system walked away saying something's not quite right here. And I think that's going to be a silver lining to that terrible episode. So those are a couple of examples. Colorado is focusing on work release programs and fairly paid work programs for people currently incarcerated. I think that's going to be very beneficial. Washington State also does some of that. So there's a lot that can be picked from. In California, you have or you'll know the nonprofit that does coding, teaches people to be software engineers, and in prison they have a web page creation shop. Josh, can you help me with the name? Right. The mutual gray hair is not conducive to recalling these things, and they're a terrific place too. So I'm going to be very embarrassed when I see. Who is it, John? Yeah, The Last Mile. Thank you very much. So that's doing all this. So you're seeing much more involvement in this kind of thing across the country, and that's really good. It has to happen quickly. There's great urgency to this. We got to start lining these things up right, because we if we run out of labor, as we are going to, if we don't change our practices, that's how you get to the next recession. It fosters too much inflation. A lot of the supply chain issues are really labor issues. We don't have labor to move things along. So, yes, sir.
Hi, Peter Brewer, Commissioner of Legal Policy. I just have one comment. Well, first, thank you. This is, I love your book.
Oh, thank you.
Flipping through it and listening to the same chapter.
Just start chapter 6.
But I just wanted to make a comment about, we have two really good packages in the House right now that I hope the business community can just get out in front of and support because they would really help with part of what you're talking about. One is the bail reform and, just pretrial rights, pretrial reform. It's
Like have a reentry plan and, yep, yep. Yeah, oh, yep.
I would think the business community would be all enthusiastically behind that, because
So I tell my friends in the reform community, your job is to improve the supply of labor in this way. My job is to improve the demand. And the challenge is that the business community does not yet universally understand that this is a great talent pool. And it's going to take time to get there. I hope, you're actually fortunate in Michigan that you have a core of businesses, particularly in Western Michigan, that have had experience in this and can attest to this being a viable and actually a great labor pool, and one where we need to support our workforce through appropriate reform measures. But I think a large part of the business community is not there yet. This labor shortage is going to make them aware, but it's going to take time. And frankly, the reason I wrote the book, if any of you are authors, you know people don't write books for money. A major portion was to legitimize this and to show that there's real companies doing this. I spent a lot of time on the back cover soliciting endorsements from people I thought could make a difference and would have an influence, but we've got a long way to go. And so John knows I give up my vacation days, or half of my vacation days I've dedicated to going out and speaking about this, because people need to hear this message. So, all right, well, thank you very much, and a special thanks to John Cooper and Josh Ho for sponsoring this meeting and for having me in again. Thank you.